welcome to Insight 2022 Day 4, and a huge welcome to Nick Carding. As many of you know who have joined us today, analysts and certainly the analytics profession are super popular at the moment. You know, we are, everyone is keen to be our friends. Everyone is talking about us, and all of this is built from the wonderful response from COVID, and then the work that has gone from here. Simon Stevens said through COVID the critical role we play. Amanda Pritchard says that we save more lives than a good anaesthetist. And Tim Ferriss, Sonia Patel, Julian Kelly, Ming Tang, all of them talk nearly every week about the critical role that analytics and data and digital will play in the future of the NHS. This year alone, there have been 9 data and analytics strategies released. In fact, they were released, 9 of them, in just 4 months alone. And how on earth are jobbing analysts supposed to be able to do our work and keep up with this? Well, the only way I keep up with all the whole host of things going on is I read Nick's stuff. And so if you don't know Nick, so Nick is, and to quote Alistair McClellan, the leading healthcare technology journalist in England, if not the UK, maybe more, maybe the world, Nick. Nick was nominated for News Story of the Year, and for one of his amazing stories on the new hospital program, which is I always find really funny. I've worked on the new hospital program since it started, and somehow Nick still knows more than me about what's going on at the new hospital program. It's amazing. But Nick is a wonderful journalist, and again, you can see catch his stuff in HSJ. Nick is also an expert speed chess player, so this is great. So I was desperate to have him come and have a chat to us today, just to talk about and for him to reflect on the last few years, and because he's been a part of this huge change and the things that are happening. So what's going on, and with the bosses, ministers, the centre, and in this kind of landscape, his thoughts on the current situation. And he may talk about FDP, but I'm not sure if that's just going to wind us all up, but that would be really exciting. And of course, the Goldacre Review, which is close to my heart. And then, of course, his view on the future. And I think it's going to be really exciting with someone with a pulse across all of these things to see where he goes from there. So I would love to have loads of questions from you guys to ask Nick at the end. If there's anything that's absolutely burning that you need to know, make sure that we ask at the end. You can put your hand up. You can even, I believe, unmic and talk to us as we kind of go through. So many thanks. So I will now pass over to Nick and to hear more about it. So welcome, Nick, and thank you very much.
Hi, Andy. Thanks very much. Thanks for asking me to speak at this event. So yeah, as Andy said, I'm a senior correspondent at HSJ. I'm sure most of you watching know what HSJ is, but just in case anyone is not fully aware of us, we're a news title covering the NHS, and our readers tend to be NHS managers at local, regional and national level, and we're also quite well read by suppliers to the NHS who are looking to understand the NHS better and how government policy affects the health service. So I joined HSJ about 5.5 years ago. My background is in local news, so I began my career as a sports reporter, in fact, at the Newark Advertiser in Nottinghamshire. Then I became health correspondent at the Eastern Daily Press in Norfolk, and then I joined HSJ in 2017. And when I joined HSJ, I was initially handed the very glamorous area of procurement, NHS procurement and non-clinical services. That was sort of my first news patch for HSJ. But then I became the tech correspondent about 3 years ago, so autumn 2019. I should point out that I've got no background, like I say, in the NHS or in technology for that matter. I'm a journalist who writes about technology in the NHS. Sometimes that sort of seems to surprise people that at HSJ we don't actually, most of us don't have an NHS background. But being a journalist, what it means is that I suppose I'm an observer of the NHS tech landscape without really being sort of part of it, if that makes sense. So I've got no kind of preconceptions or allegiances to NHS organisations or suppliers. My job is basically talk to people, to hear what's going on, and then report any news that I think will interest our readers. And so I saw the blurb for this webinar is all about how analytics and data has made headlines in the NHS recently, and what the main sort of stories and decisions have been, and what to look out for in the future. So I'm just going to give you my views as a journalist from my position as an observer of NHS tech. And I'm going to sort of say it in 3 parts. So first, I'm going to just reflect a bit on the last couple of years, as Andy said, then discuss some of the ongoing issues that I think are important and affecting the analytics sector. And then finally, I'll attempt a little bit of crystal ball gazing at the end. So just looking back a bit, when I was preparing for this webinar, I looked back in my records for all the different speeches made by health secretaries about technology since I joined HSJ, so 5.5 years ago, and how many of those speeches specifically had some details about the role of data and analytics. And in total, I managed to find 13 speeches in the last 5 years about tech from health ministers, dating back to Jeremy Hunt, Matt Hancock, Sajid Javid, and of course now Steve Barclay. And all of those speeches, of course, promised the delivery of a much needed digital revolution for the NHS. But to my horror, I found that across those 13 speeches, the words analytics or analyst or analysis, they cropped up just twice. In all those thousands of words that the ministers talked about in the speeches, those words only appeared twice in the speeches. And I think that's a sort of damning example of how under the radar analytics has clearly been in the minds of ministers, I think, for the last few years. The word data did, of course, feature more in the speeches, most usually in the phrase, unlock the power of data. But very rarely, like I say, in the speeches, did the health secretaries speaking kind of go into more detail about the role of analysts or analytics in this regard. So that was sort of a interesting point to start with. In the same time frames, so again since 2017, there have been quite a few NHS tech strategy documents, but again I found very few of them actually sort of focused much on NHS data and analytics specifically. Even in the What Good Looks Like framework, which is obviously a high profile document that came out last year, and that's the sort of roadmap by which NHS trusts and ICSs could base their digitization journeys on. Analytics only features in 1 of 7 success measures for ICSs, and it's not even mentioned in any kind of context for trusts. And it really is only the last 6 months or so that we've finally had some sort of policy documents that are specifically focused on data and analytics in the shape of obviously the Goldacre review and the 2 versions of the Data Saves Lives strategy that the government put out this year. So my sort of conclusion, which I'm sure comes as no surprise to you, but I just thought those bits sort of illustrate the fact that clearly, despite the increasing focus on the role of tech in the NHS in the last few years, there's been a real lack of focus on analytics and data, which, as again, it will come as no surprise to you, obviously. But what that's meant for is that there's been very little strategic direction for NHS analytics, and sort of the leadership of that whole agenda, as far as I can tell, has been very absent. And so decisions have been taken which have not aligned with perhaps previous directions, strategies, only to then be abandoned and forgotten about when the next set of tech chiefs are assembled. And I think ultimately that kind of vacuum has led to some issues which has had a real impact on the NHS's ability to successfully implement some data and analytics projects. For example, it was really disappointing last year to see the sort of public debate around the GPDPR, the GP patient data collection that NHS Digital were pushing, but that obviously crashed and burned dramatically last year. And when that whole debate unfolded, there was no one who was really talking about the benefits that improved data collection would have for for NHS planning and analytics. You know, the debate was mainly focused on, from the NHS's point of view, trying to debunk some of the conspiracy theories, and also highlighting, you know, rightly the positive outcomes of data sharing during COVID. But I felt that there was no real authoritative figure at NHSE or NHS Digital who really took charge of the debate. And I think one way of doing that would have been to make the public understand how analysing the data would have greatly helped make the NHS much more efficient and responsive to local needs. I felt like there was no one talking about, you know, the benefits to NHS planning in that whole debate. And unfortunately now, that program looks like it's going down the care.data route of not really seeing the light of day, despite it obviously being a worthy ambition and something that the NHS should have been able to deliver. And then of course you can't look back and reflect without reflecting on the pandemic. And I think obviously, you know, it's cliche, but it's obviously hard to overstate the sort of significance of the pandemic on NHS tech policy. I do believe that without the pandemic, we would still be living in a world where NHSX and NHS Digital remain separate bodies, because it was really thanks to the pandemic that the leaders in NHS and Whitehall realised that the siloed way in which the NHS holds and shares data wasn't really fit for purpose. So for the data and analytics community, clearly the pandemic and the post-pandemic world, it should really be a sort of new dawn of opportunity, given all the newfound enthusiasm in the highest echelons for digital transformation. But that comes with its own challenges, and that brings me on to sort of how I see the current landscape. Obviously, at the moment, for me as a journalist, a lot of the talk and my coverage is about the federated data platform, and exactly how successful or unsuccessful that project is going to be. I know it's a controversial and such a live topic, so I couldn't resist sharing a few thoughts on that. And there are a couple of points that I'll make on it. I think the first thing I'd say is that in some ways the FDP is kind of the perfect example of what I was saying earlier has been the problem for NHS data and analytics, in that, you know, you've got, I think it was Matt Hancock who said several times that the NHS must learn the lessons from the National Programme for IT. And he was clear that one of those lessons was that the NHS should not try to procure a new national IT system centrally. That's a direct quote from one of his many tech speeches a few years ago. So, you know, he set a clear strategy which opposed large central solutions. And then a few years later, NHSE announces plans for a new central solution, despite there not really having been any clear indication that a change of policy has been made. Of course, the pandemic changed a lot of things. That's understandable, but it's kind of an example of something coming a bit out of the blue. That being said, I think, you know, the FDP seems to be a logical solution to some of the NHS's problems, but I do have a lot of doubts about whether it will succeed. National tech implementations that have not quite gone to plan. I completely understand that some trusts and ICSs might think the FDP is unnecessary because they are already accessing and sharing their data locally. But at the moment, I do think those probably are a minority of trusts and ICSs, and there are still far too many organisations who are not really digitally mature enough to have that kind of capability, which NHSE hopes to offer through the FDP in the sort of coming years. There's quite a bit of concern about the money spent on the FDP. I think it's, what is it, about 360 million over 5 years, I think. I actually think, I mean, if you break that down over the 5-year term and divide it by the 42 ICSs, then it does only work out, I think, to a few £1 million a year per ICS. And I think actually that's not too expensive in comparison to giving each ICS the same amount and letting them do what they will, and ending up with a landscape where everyone's running their own systems. I'm not sure the money thing is the most important issue in terms of the FDP. One aspect that I'm a bit unsure about is how NHS England will win the argument with the public that the FDP can be trusted as a secure data environment, despite it not being the sort of environment as defined by the Goldacre review, obviously, because Goldacre talks about the trusted research environment, and NHS have said that it's not going to be that. I think that's something that privacy campaigners are going to seize upon, and I hope NHS England has some good answers to that question, because I think that's a much bigger question rather than all the noise about Palantir and whether the procurement is rigged in their favour, which, as far as I can tell, I really don't think that is the case. I suppose my main concern about the FDP is that the national commitment to the programme might start to wane before the benefits have been realised, and that the platform just becomes a damp squib, which is only sort of fleetingly used by the local NHS. I don't think enough engagement has been done with trusts and ICSs, and it's one of the sort of biggest cliches of all that if you don't get the local buy-in for a nationally led tech implementation, then the project is not going to succeed. We've seen before many times that government funding for programs can dry up sooner than expected, especially if political priorities change. And with the current state of the country's finances and obviously all the political turmoil we've just been through, it's not the easiest environment to roll out the FDP at the moment. And I think, for the next couple of years, it's going to be a tough environment to roll out such a large sort of program. The fact that the procurement of the FDP has already been delayed to this extent, due to governance and funding issues, also doesn't fill me with a lot of confidence. But we've seen some developments very recently. Steve Barclay has mentioned the FDP twice now, once in a speech at the NHS Providers Conference 2 weeks ago, and then he mentioned it again on BBC One when he was being interviewed by Laura Kunsberg on her Sunday political programme. So he doesn't say that unless he knows that the FDP is going to go ahead. So I'm assuming the tender will be launched very shortly. So the FDP is here, whether we like it or not. I could talk all day about the FDP actually, but I will move on. The other thing I just wanted to touch on in this part of my talk, I suppose it's a little bit linked to the FDP, but that's what's happening at local level to improve organisations' analytical abilities. Another fear I have regarding the FDP is that it will divert too much attention at national level at the expense of supporting data and analytics staff in trusts and ICSs. And in my 3 years as a tech reporter here, I've seen sort of relatively little activity from the centre in terms of offering more resource and capacity to trusts, and that seems like a missed opportunity. I also, as Andy said, I cover NHS estates, and if I compare the analytics sector to the estate sector, I feel like there's a much kind of clearer organisation of reporting, support and accountability in the estates sector, in that you have a national head of estates, you have regional estates teams providing support to trusts, you have established annual ICS estate strategies, and then you have your local trust estates teams. But for NHS analytics, and I think Goldacre obviously made this point as well in his review, the workforce is incredibly dispersed. There doesn't seem to me there is a very clear hierarchy which enables support and expertise when it's needed from the bottom up. I appreciate the comparison with estates. Estates is obviously a broader area than data and analytics, but I do think there's a lot more to be done in terms of bringing together the analytics workforce and supporting them at local level. If I go back to the what good looks like framework, it talks about the need for using data and analytics to redesign care pathways, to create integrated care models, even letting primary care networks and the likes be able to access local analytics functions. But it makes no mention of how that should be established, how this should be structured and supported. And Ming Tang, obviously, she may be the NHS's chief data and analytics officer, but I do see very few such job roles in senior positions at NHS trusts and ICSs. I'm not saying they should be on the board. Ultimately, that's what the CIO is for. But I think I just would make the point that as an outsider looking in on the NHS, I find it hard to find much detail about the analytics workforce and the logic of how it's sort of structured at the moment, and that's disproportionate to how often ministers talk about unlocking the power of data, which is sort of one of those standard lines in any ministerial speech when it comes to tech. So that brings me on to the sort of, I suppose, the last part of my talk, which is the bit where I get my crystal ball out and try to predict the future. I have to say, with 3 health secretaries in the last 4 months and lots of turbulence at national level, it's become very hard to guess what's going to happen next, but I will have a try. In terms of the data and analytics sector, I think the big question for me is, how far does NHS England and the government go in implementing the Goldacre review? I thought the review broadly hit nearly all the right notes, but it struck me while reading it that it was making a lot of recommendations, which I can't see them all being delivered, even though I've got the impression most people seem to agree on most of the recommendations being needed. One of the most important recommendations is that the NHS carries out all its analysis of data in so-called secure data environments. That's the government phrase. I mean, I have to say already here, I think the government and NHS is sort of slightly opening itself up to a degree of attack, because the Goldacre review clearly used the term trusted research environment, while the government's data strategy, which was sort of the response to Goldacre's review, says it's going to be a secure data environment. And, it's not clear to me as a kind of non-tech expert in the kind of technical sense what the difference is, or why the government came up with a different name for those environments. And I guess my worry is that doesn't really help make it easier for the public to understand how exactly their data is being stored. But yeah, so carrying out the analysis in SDE or TREs, whatever we call it, that's clearly a vital recommendation of the report, and one which the government is very likely to continue to support. We'll get an early indication of their progress towards these secure data environments next month. Because I was rereading the Data Saves Lives strategy, and in that the government commits to delivering the policy and requirements needed to implement SDEs across the NHS by the end of next month, and that should also have a roadmap with sort of clear timescales for each area. So that'll be very interesting to see. A couple of other commitments I saw that are due now is to create what they call a data pact between the public and healthcare system, and also an information governance framework for integrated health and care. All those things are due next month. And please shout if you're aware of these actions being completed already, because I've got them in my diary to follow up and to see what the progress is like. And then the other sort of key recommendation of the Goldacre review that I'm hopeful will be delivered is, and I touched on it earlier, it's the work to kind of improve the structure and the professionalization of the NHS analytics workforce. The government has given itself until March 2024 to agree the sort of necessary frameworks and the guidelines and the policies to support the workforce better. obviously I'd wish it could have kind of happened faster, but I suppose it's probably a sort of sensible time scale, because it does take time to put these things in place, for what could potentially be quite a large change for the profession. But again, it is dependent on NHS England having enough capacity to see that through. And of course, another worry is that the NHSE is going through quite a turbulent time right now with the mergers with NHS Digital and Health Education England. And of course, it's been tasked with delivering quite a hefty headcount reduction. So I think it will be quite a job for Ming Tang, who doubtless will be busy with the FTP as well in the next sort of few months, to oversee all that as well. But it is going to be absolutely crucial that NHSE retains the capacity it needs to deliver on that kind of very important recommendation from Goldacre. So I really hope that happens, and I think it will to an extent, but I suppose I am a bit fearful it may not quite happen either fast enough or be as wide enough as it should be. There's one other area where I sort of have quite big concerns about Goldacre's recommendations not being successfully implemented, and that is the whole bit about how to build public trust. I'm hopeful that a lot of lessons have been learned from GPDPR, but then that's what people said about care.data. And it really feels like the NHS really struggles to address this question of trust. A recent example of that came in a story that I wrote a few weeks ago, where the National Data Guardian had warned ICSs that some shared care record programs were sharing sensitive patient data with third parties unlawfully. And of course, in all these incidents, they're almost always probably the result of a misunderstanding of the very complicated IG rules. But sharing data unlawfully is, it's like being over the limit in a car. It just can't really be accepted under any circumstances. And there was another example, again, a couple of weeks ago, another story I wrote. NHS England instructed NHS Digital to use Palantir's Foundry platform to collect more patient data from trusts. And NHSE, in their sort of justification for it, they continue to use pseudonymization as part of the justification, despite Ben Goldacre, I think quite rightly, saying in his review that the term pseudonymized data, it's not the same as anonymized data, and that term really should either be scrapped or it should be refined to make much clearer that what you're talking about ultimately is re-identifiable data. So I mean, I know that kind of shift in language and culture, it requires a lot of kind of cultural change, behavioral change. But given that, in a body as large as the NHS, I do worry that these incidents, they hinder some of that crucial work to build trust with the public. So I anticipate more outcry about some of these issues going forward from campaigners and parts of the public. And very finally, just to take a kind of broader view on NHS tech in general, beyond just data and analytics. I think it's very early days, but I think Steve Barclay is probably largely on board with most of the tech agenda, as I suppose his support for the FTP shows. But I do think his sort of reputation as a sort of, he's very hot on efficiency and not necessarily someone who's going to be asking for lots of extra money. I think his appointment won't make it easier for tech chiefs to retain capital budgets in the coming years. I think you're all probably aware there's been some stories in the last few months about tech funds being at risk because they're being drained to prop up day-to-day revenue costs. A lot of capital after the next spending review is likely going to be reserved for the new hospitals program, and that program is ultimately politically far more significant than any ongoing NHS tech program. So I'm wary of the impact of that on the amount of resource for tech going forward, as I think for Steve Barclay, he's going to be more interested in delivering progress on the 40 new hospitals program, which, as we've written many times, is very delayed and quite controversial at times. You know, he's going to be more focused, I think, on ensuring that that program has the resource it needs rather than NHS digitization. Steve Barclay was also a junior health minister. I think it was about 4 years ago, and he was the minister in charge of estates at that point, so he's already familiar with the estates world. So yeah, I think it's going to be a tough few years ahead in terms of tech finances, but then there's a lot you can do without too much. Well, you always need the money, but hopefully there are other ways of making improvements as well that aren't wholly reliant on lots of new money. But yeah, so those were really my thoughts at the moment. I hope it's been interesting hearing my perspective, and happy to discuss anything further. So I'll hand back to you, Andy.
Thank you ever so much, Nick. And we do have some questions coming through, and I think what you've shared, I think isn't going to be a huge surprise to people, but I think that the level of confusion and noise out there, I think, of stuff going on, I think just shows you how, as you say, where's our clear voice and where's that clear voice coming from? So really shines through. And again, I'll share my frustrations if we have time at the end around the lack of response to Goldacre and how they seem to have cherry-picked what they want for Goldacre, and how analysts seem to be the forgotten part of this. So the first question, which is, analysts, how do analysts kind of separate themselves? So what can we do to raise our profile? So not just as a community, but for the 160 odd people here, what can we do to try and separate ourselves out from a data asset or a bit of software? Because we're the human resource, we're the people who make the magic happen. Yeah, we're the people who save more lives, not the data. How can we do something about that? Oh
yeah, it's tricky. I mean, I guess if there was an easy answer, then you'd be doing it. You know, it's very hard for me to say. I mean, I'm a journalist, and you know, stories are really important. So I suppose it probably sounds too simple, but I just guess the more you can tell your story about the successful work that you're doing, the better, is probably the first thing I would say. You know, whether that's internally in your organization, getting on to the comms teams in your organizations to say, we've just done this piece of work, you should be putting out press releases about this. You know, you should be contacting both, you know, other internal comms in the NHS and also external media about your work for case studies. You know, I suppose, you know, that's going to be my answer to that, coming at it as a journalist, because ultimately the best way to kind of raise the profile is to tell your story, and the best way to do that is just to kind of share all the work that you're doing. It's kind of, I'm trying to think if there are any other tips, but with the NHS being such a kind of big clunky organization, I do think really you just have to shout very loudly. You know, I get that kind of the feeling that is some, you can't really understate the importance of that, but it's difficult. I wish I had kind of an easier answer, but for me as a journalist, you know, and sometimes people do say that, ask the question, how can we kind of get more attention and focus? And I do think it's just about really trying to put yourself out there and highlighting the work that you're doing. You know, obviously come to HSJ with your stories, and we can't probably publish all of them, but we can certainly publish what we can. But yeah, just really try and share the work that you're doing as much as possible, using the sort of channels that are available to you. So it's probably not like a hugely helpful answer, but as a journalist, that's probably where I'm sort of coming from. Well, I think that's an ask. There's 160 people on the call. If everyone, you all have a comms department, if you're working in a trust or an ICB or somewhere like that, if you can work with them to craft a blog or something about the interesting work you're doing. And remember, this is the life-saving work that is changing the NHS, according to Tim Ferriss, Julian Kelly, Ming Tang.
people will be interested in your story, and we're not expecting you to be awesome at writing blogs or those bits. And but I know if I can get in the HSJ, I know, and I've got the writing literacy of a 7-year-old. My son does better at spelling than I do. You guys will be able to tell something much more compelling, I'm sure. And so if you work with your comms guys, so maybe the ask for you, everyone watching today, and again, if you need help with that kind of thing, if you let me know, and we have our comms team who can help. Maybe we can run a session on how to run and write blogs and how to kind of share stories. But remember, nearly all of our organizations have comms people who would love to hear from you, because we can share, share the stories about the wonderful work you're doing, and then share them with Nick as we kind of go through from there. So and then hopefully, this answers one of the other questions about, lots of the money and investment appears to be pushed into digital. And this is this idea of digital being, it's the software, it's the platforms, it's the data, not the humans who turn it into actionable insights, not the people like us who help make the actual decisions. And so I'm guessing raising our profile will help to try and kind of combat some of the, some of that imbalance at the moment, where the answers, as I say, from the Goldacre review, the answers all seem to be data rather than data and software rather than supporting analysts, which he made a big deal about supporting analysts and the grassroots organizations, NHSR community, PICOM, AFA, and those people.
Yeah, just I think that shows why the event you've got running now is so important, that you've got a platform and forum where people can come together, and other sectors do this very well. I think they have kind of a clear body kind of fighting for them, and I have to be honest, and when I've the last few years, I've not been aware of like a kind of, oh yeah, this is the body for NHS analysts that I can go to and say, oh hey, what are the issues affecting analysts in the NHS? I think prior to the Goldacre review, I'd barely written anything about NHS analysts because I wasn't really that aware of what they were doing, I'm ashamed to say. Whereas in other sectors, you've got other kind of sectors, both inside tech and outside tech, where there's a clear representative body for that profession. But for analysts, I think that's it's probably my own ignorance, but I wasn't aware too much of the kind of that body existing. So I think anything that analysts can do to kind of unify that and as a body, as one workforce, shout a bit more loudly and coherently as one, that's really important. And events like this kind of help that, because it puts it on the radar for people.
Yeah, and so I declare my conflict of interest here as president of AFA. Clearly, I haven't done well enough this year. But to be fair, I've only started this year, but I think we're doing a better job of raising, we're doing further work on raising the profile of analysts. So if you can join AFA, but AFA have local branches, but there are other organizations out there, like FedIP and others who represent analysts kind of going forwards. But AFA tries to represent the 13,500 analysts that we're supposed to have. Another question, Nick, the contraction at NHSE, so 24,000 to 16,000, do you think it's going to affect the analytical community based at NHSE?
Yes, I do. I think probably every area is going to be affected. I don't know if they mean in terms of the analytics team in the NHSE centrally, or just how is it going to be a big impact on the analytics community generally. I the answer is probably both. I guess it sort of comes back to what I was saying about my main worry in that respect is that the headcount reduction means that NHSE will only retain the amount of capacity needed for less kind of programs. So they might say, okay, well, we've got the FTP, that's kind of our flagship analytics program, so we need to make sure that the capacity that we retain are the people that are working on that and have the expertise to deliver that. And as I said in my talk, my worry is that means that there's going to be much less focus on delivering some of those other recommendations in the review, and that kind of, you know, the professionalization of the analytics workforce, the support that's given to them locally. I worry that that's going to get not enough focus. So I think that would be my answer to that question is yes, I think it will affect the local analytics workforce, and my fear is it will affect it, like I say, through the kind of lesser support which is offered. I don't know what, I mean, I'm sure Ming Tang probably would say the same, and I'm sure she would try and avoid that from happening, but ultimately it does come down to how much capacity they can resource, and there's going to be some things have to go, unfortunately, but I hope they can just strike the right balance, but I'm not sure they'll be able to.
Yeah, I was lucky enough to speak to Ming last night at an event, and I think she's saying there's around an estimated 2,000 analysts now in NHSE with the merger of digital and X and with NHSE, and of course it's going to be hard hard to justify why they should be completely exempt compared to others. We've also seen funding cut for Analyst X, which was the community. To be fair, no, most of it was voluntary, and the analyst community, people on this call, and many of them have contributed to Analyst X, but the funding for that has been cut, and also for centres of excellence. So it's we're already starting to see the bite that that you mentioned there. Now, with the emergence of integrated care systems and integrated care boards, and we've had a wonderful series of talks. We had, Alistair talking to Sir David Nicholson. We had Sally Markwell, a prof from Oxford Brookes, talking about how systems have to work together in the struggle to make decisions together because of all the conflicting priorities, different goals, everything else. Is it now wrong to start thinking of data and analytics in terms of just the NHS anymore? Or do we now have to include our kind of broader family, so our friends in public health, local authority, emergency services, voluntary organisations? And realistically, can this be done?
I think that's a really good question. I think the answer definitely is yes. It needs to, where possible, include much more collaborative working with public health, social care, all these functions that sit outside the NHS. Obviously, I appreciate it's probably very, very complicated and difficult, and with all these different systems being used, and just having the time to orchestrate this. But I do think ICSs that can demonstrate that they have taken that seriously, and perhaps come up with some of their own initiatives to run, even if they're quite small scale programs, but programs that maybe could be scaled. If they can demonstrate that they have thought about that, done some work on it, got some provisional outcomes or data outcomes showing something positive, I think those ICSs are more likely to attract more investment from the centre. When there's new funding being made available, the centre wants to give it to areas that they know are going to be spending that money properly and deliver on something new. And so ICSs that can kind of show that they've already been working on this kind of wider collaboration piece will, I think, and based on previous kind of examples of how the NHS distributes funding, they will be first in line to get that money. So I think that's a really important point. And yeah, I really think that if that's something which is not being discussed sort of across ICSs, then it should be, because I think there's a lot that you can gain from it. But I appreciate that probably it's very hard to kind of find the time for it and the resource, and I guess that's where it kind of you need the support of your boards and your CIOs and CEOs. And I get, it harks back to that point about also telling a story, right? If you can kind of demonstrate that this is what's going to happen, if we can just do this work with our wider kind of colleagues, then all these things could happen. So yeah, my answer would be 100% yes, that should be the case. And I wish people all the best of luck in doing that, because I know it's going to be hard. But I would thoroughly say absolutely now is the time for that.
And for those of you who want to talk, to learn a bit more about system working and the challenges, as I say, there were some wonderful talks earlier on Insight 2022. They're all recorded. You can go back, but as you say, we have Alistair and Sir David talking about the challenges that they see, but also some very practical advice from Prof. Sally Markwell about the challenges of this. And of course, Nick, as you reported, the potential misuse in quotes of Section 251 to link data for looking at population health management, something that's very dear to my heart. So that's the one reason I'm excited to be an analyst, will now make data sharing an even bigger challenge when it's used for aggregated and not direct care, which many of us were doing. So it creates a bigger challenge going forwards. The next question. Does the NHS need to bring about a badge analyst certification like they have in the civil service to raise the profile of analysts?
Yeah, I think it probably wouldn't hurt. Yeah, I suppose. I mean, I think it. Again, I'm not a workforce expert, but I think it sounds like that would certainly be a sort of a more positive step towards, again, that kind of improving the sort of structure, the professionalization of the workforce. Anything that can kind of make it easier to sort of identify who is an analyst. That means that you're doing this particular piece of work. I'm sure that would be helpful. I don't know. I know, as going back to the Goldacre review, he obviously talked about there's very little sort of set training pathways. It's all a bit, what is an NHS analyst? What does that actually mean? And that's a question I would struggle to answer, as an outsider. So I guess if you did bring in that kind of consistent sort of mark of quality, if you like, for want of a better word, then my feeling is that would help. I mean, there may be some the downsides to it. I'm not sure. And again, I don't know if there's examples of this in other parts of the NHS. I'm just trying to think if there are any. But yeah, it sounds like it's absolutely an idea worth doing, and anything to kind of make the workforce more structured and I suppose better understood would help. So my gut feeling is yes, that sounds like a good idea. I'm not familiar with the civil service, how it works specifically on that, but yeah, it sounds like a good plan.
Yes, and just to remind people on the call, of course, that you can professionally register and at different levels and going through organisations like AFA. So you can become, from a kind of, I think it's kind of an associate analyst all the way through to a leading practitioner, and they kind of effectively you're handing in a dossier of your work and your CV to prove at what level you are. But at the moment, it's when we're kind of looking at it, of course, it's not mandatory, but unlike our friends in accounting and finance, where you can't be an accountant unless you're an accountant trained and have CPD, yet me as a health economist, I can advise an ICS to move tens of millions of pounds and build predictive algorithms to change how we would treat and care for patients. And no one cares. Well, I'm sure they do care about my qualifications, but there's no registered group to say that, I am, capable and competent to do this work. Just that, I am registered and I am a leading practitioner. I promise I've done my homework, guys. But just to say that there are badges for that out there, but at the moment it's not particularly desirable. I'm not going to get a job or not get a job by not having a badge. And but again, I think this is something that I'm kind of really keen to kind of look at. Nick, you also touched on very briefly there this idea of having some representation at the board. Do you think every board should have a chief analytical officer or someone who can at least check the maths that's been done to help make those decisions, to make sure the decision or the maths done is appropriate?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's it's a tricky one because, on the one hand, I kind of want to say yes, because it's, you want the analytics sector to be represented, and because of the such an important job that you do, you obviously, I think, would benefit from having kind of clear board level representation, because what you do can affect other areas that other board members work on. So, on the one hand, yes, would be kind of my resounding answer. But then I do appreciate at the same time, boards can become a bit too big if there are too many people on them, and if you're going to have chief analytics officer, chief information officer, you know, I don't know if you'd have a chief data officer or if that would sit with the analytics officer, you know, then you've got, you know, chief estates, the head of estates, they're saying they should be on the board, you know, the head of digital transformation, head of finance. And you do, I suppose my only worry is that sometimes the more people you put on boards, the less effective they become. I suppose it depends a bit on, I suppose, the CIO and how good they are at understanding the analytics element to their kind of overseeing job. If they are, you know, I think it's probably, you know, I don't know. Again, this is me as an outsider. I don't know everything about how much CIOs know about analytics, but I would hope that, you know, CIOs take analytics very seriously and are very clued up on it. That may or may not be the case. You're probably better qualified to say that than I am. I would hope that that is something which the CIO ultimately, you know, could be trusted to kind of represent at board level. But then equally, you know, if you have an organization which does take tech very seriously and you know, and it kind of wants to appoint a chief analytics officer to its board, I think it's not a bad idea and would be very interesting to kind of see how that would go. I just think if it was kind of like across every board had to have it, I'd be slightly wary of that, because I think that would probably dilute the boards in some cases. But I think it should be kind of case by case basis. And yeah, for those boards that have a particular interest in tech and digital, I think it's a good idea. Otherwise, you know, maybe you have to kind of trust the CIO to kind of fight that corner for you, and hopefully they'll be clued up enough to represent the analytics side well. So I don't know, there's a bit of a sort of yes and no answer really.
I'll take the yes bit, and that's what I'll write up. And I ignore the pragmatism about diluting the board. Of course, we should be there, all of you guys. For those of you who know how to use the reactions on Zoom, can we have a reaction, a thumbs up, a positive something if you are professionally registered? If you know, whoever you're professionally registered with, clinical informaticians, AFA, those, anybody professionally registered on the call at all? And as we kind of hope to see a rain of those kind of come in, we'll have a kind of look. But so the biggest obstacle we face is access to the data we need. Primary care has the crown jewels of data, some wonderful kind of stuff. But the inability to extract data from systems like Foundry makes it more and more difficult. What do you see changing with that from all of your work?
Oh, yeah, that is a very tough question. This is, yeah, crystal ball gazing in the extreme, because it's such a difficult topic. What do I see changing? At the moment, unfortunately, I don't see that much changing, to be honest. And that's a concern, I think. You know, the GDPR program was a real kind of slap in the face for anyone who was hoping that the NHS would get better at sharing primary care data. I think that's done a lot of damage to that whole agenda. So I'm not sure there will be that much change going forward. I mean, obviously, DH has published the Data Saves Lives strategy. I am trying to remember what it said about primary care data in that. I'm not quite sure I do remember anything right now, but yeah, I think I don't see very much changing at the moment. Obviously, there's going to be, I mentioned the this new IG framework. I don't know, that probably isn't going to change very much. It's a bit of a depressing answer, but as far as a journalist, as an outsider, in terms of primary care data, I don't see very much changing yet, which is makes me a bit sad to say. But that's sort of how I see it at the moment, unfortunately. I'm not aware that there's any major sort of, you know, changes coming. I could be wrong. There might be things I've missed. There may be work ongoing that I'm not aware of, but as far as I can see at the moment, I don't see very much changing.
And I may get this horribly wrong, and please correct me if I'm wrong in the chat. I believe the secure data environment is the environment where we have it's accessible data for direct care, those kind of things. The trusted research environment is an anonymized data set where we can practice and do research and see how things change over time. So I think the SDE is much closer to the patient, and something that we would do to affect care. The TRE is something that researchers and people like, I do work at Imperial, but lots of my work, even for the NHS, is using those kind of environments to be able to build models for then people to use and kind of go from there.
That's a helpful explainer, thanks. So I mean, hopefully there'll be some news on SDEs quite soon. Like I said, that's expected next month. So it may be that they're going to say this could be a big change happening very shortly. Fingers crossed. But
and of course, Ben got Open Safely, which was all primary care linked to all secondary care. He got that done over COVID. Of course, it's now a wonderful data set with 60 million records, but of course only accessible, I believe, at the moment still for if you've got it's got to be a COVID reason to do the work. We're running out of time. A couple more questions. So again, something really close to my heart is the training and the availability of training. We did a survey with our friends at FedIP. Loads of analysts don't have access to training, and we're struggling to recruit. What can we do about that?
I think that's something that just has to be raised to the highest level inside the NHS, i.e., I mean, the thing is, I suppose Ming Tang is again already aware of that, and I'm sure he's fighting for that to get better. But I just think you have to make the argument so strongly as you can, and say this is why we need more training made available, more demonstrate where the vacancies are, what you're missing out on, put it all in a narrative, and then just shout about it as much as possible. It's a bit of a lame answer again, but that's I could say like, oh yeah, you should go to NHS England and try and push for this, but I'm sure NHS England's top analytics people are pushing for it as well. And I suppose it's like, where do you go after that? You have to go higher, but it's very difficult to get the ear of the ministers for that kind of work, because it's not like a short-term solution. It's something which is going to take time, investment, and for ministers at the moment, it's very difficult for them to sign off on stuff which is not going to bring about some quick fix. I feel so. Yeah, I wish I knew the answer, to be honest. I don't think I do. I think I would just say put the case as compellingly as you can to as high up as possible, and hope. I don't have any kind of concrete ideas for how you might change that. Other than that,
I think you've started to allude it, and I think this is one kind of common theme in many of the answers is, analysts per se, there's a wonderful stereotype that we're kind of introvert, quiet wallflowers who just get on and do it. Obviously we're the brains and the looks of any organization, Nick, that. And but as all analysts are, but maybe it's one of these things that we don't shout about the excellent work that we do. And maybe this is the big ask here is, if we want to make sure that we have access to training, if we don't, we need to shout about it and raise. If we think something is important, we should shout about it and raise. And of course, if you're doing great work, share it. And let people know the amazing stuff that we're doing. We have so many amazingly, competent and capable and, awesome analysts. But the problem is, it's getting those stories. If there's 13,500 of us at the moment, I heard last night that they expect there to be 35,000 analysts in the NHS in the next few years. Where are they getting these people from? Why are they doing that? How can we start the training? So it's for us, this generation of analysts, to be able to shout and sing about it. So please, for those of you, as we run out of time, you can find Nick at HSJ if you've got any stories or things and you want to share with him. I'm sure he'd be delighted to hear from you, and go from there. I just want to say a huge thank you to you, Nick, for sharing and talking to us today. There's a wonderful session after this one, an absolutely amazing one. I've shared the link about health inequality, something again close to my heart as a health economist. So please sign up to see Bola talk, and she's a wonderful speaker, really, really engaging and energetic. So I'm speaking to her. But Nick, thank you ever so much. You've been truly awesome. It's been great to see you. And thank you, everybody, for joining. Have a great weekend, and I'll speak to you soon. Okay, cheerio.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.